Welcome back to Bold Dominion, a state politics explainer podcast for a changing Virginia. I'm Mary Garner McGee. Well, it has been quite a week. I think elections are always stressful, but this one has been quite a doozy, and I hope you all are taking care of yourselves. You know, usually on Bold Dominion, I'm more interested in starting with a system or a fact of life that we all interact with, and then trying to get to the bottom of how that system came to be through politics and government. But obviously, all that stuff is, in one way or another, the consequence of elections. So today, I have two great guests, and we have a very lively discussion on the elections in Virginia this year. Nathan Moore is the former host of Bold Dominion and a big local and state government nerd. And he's joined by Michael Pope, a journalist who's been covering Virginia and Virginia politics for over 15 years. Michael Pope is also the host of Pod Virginia, which is another great podcast about Virginia politics that I think you all will really enjoy. So I encourage you to go check that out. We are going to talk some about how Virginia voted in the presidential election, but most of the conversation is about the other races on our ballot, from U.S. Senate all the way down to General Assembly special elections. And we're going to talk quite a bit about voting access and gerrymandering. So we want to start tonight by talking about the big headline, the big story. Let's talk about the national election and how it played out here in Virginia.
There was a time before Tuesday.
There was indeed time before Tuesday.
Michael, why don't you kick us off?
Well, I was looking at turnout numbers. So if you look at the presidential race here in Virginia, Harris won with 52% of the vote versus 46% of the vote for Donald Trump. So that is about 250,000 vote margin of victory, which is way smaller than lots of people were expecting. You know, if you think about the run up to the election, there was a whole lot of talk about Harris having a double-digit lead in Virginia. That turned out to be completely inaccurate. All of those polls were not just wrong, but very, very wrong. Mm-hmm. And it was, 52-46 is respectable. It's certainly a majority for Harris, but it's razor thin compared to what people were expecting.
Yeah, so she won Virginia by about 5.5 points, which is much, much less than Biden won it by, 4 years ago in 2020.
So we've been hearing a lot about, how the campaign was operating in some of these major swing states. What can y'all tell us about how each campaign was operating in Virginia?
Well, Virginia Democrats benefited by having Tim Kaine on the ballot. One of the things that I think is really interesting when you look at the election returns is that Kaine not only outperformed Harris in Virginia, but the margin of victory, Kaine's margin of victory was double the Harris margin of victory. So what does that say? That Harris was actually a drag on the ticket in Virginia. That's what the numbers are telling us.
Yeah, well, Tim Kaine's been around for a long time. He's a very popular senator, and I think there's even quite a few moderates that think highly of Tim Kaine, It is fascinating, though, to think that there's out there a fairly substantial block of people that are Trump-Kaine voters.
That's real. You look at the numbers. Yes, Nathan, I'm also fascinated. I want to meet these people. If you're listening to the podcast, give me a call because I want to meet the Trump-Kaine voter.
I'll also say, when I was looking at those numbers, there were a lot of people that voted third party or wrote in. Mm-hmm. So I think some of that difference in the Kaine-Harris can probably be explained by those.
Yeah, definitely some Jill Stein Kaine, definitely some Cornel West Kaine. But there
were like 22,000 write-in votes in the presidential election in Virginia.
Yeah, a lot of protest votes this year, for sure. I don't know that it made a difference in any particular state. This was not like a Florida in 2000 situation where it was so close that it really, swayed anything. But yeah, definitely a lot of protest votes this year for a number of reasons, I think.
And Nathan, you mentioned, that Tim Kaine has been in office for a long time and stuff like that. Are there any other reasons that y'all think he might have outperformed Harris so much in Virginia?
Well, he's a white guy.
It was the year of the white guy. This is why I love being on podcasts with Nathan Moore, because you get these little zingers like that. Really good to hear the sound of your voice again, Nathan. Responding to the question that we're talking about, the election returns for the U.S. Senate race. So Kaine won with 54% of the vote versus 46% of the vote for Hung Kao as the Republican candidate, which means Tim Kaine is the big winner in the election. He had the largest margin of victory of any of these races we're going to be talking about. It was a 400,000 vote margin of victory for Tim Kaine. And I think really, in retrospect, we have to look at the Republican candidate, this guy Hung Kao, who had already lost a congressional race. So he's making a comeback. They're promoting him from losing a congressional race to losing a statewide race. When you saw his performance I remember watching the video of him speaking at the Salem rally and thinking to myself, I'm not really sure this is a candidate who is ready for prime time. His speaking style is, I would describe it as frantic, very fast, kind of hard to follow. He actually has a great background. If you look at his bios, there's a military history there. If you look at his family's history, there's a history of immigration, which is kind of the American story. So he had a story to tell. I think a lot of Republicans are looking at these election returns and wondering to themselves if he was able to tell that story to voters.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. He looks good on paper, but I remember early in the campaign, relatively early in the campaign, back in, I think, late June or maybe July, when he just wrote off Stanton.
Podunk,
yeah, Podunk Town, Stanton. And it's like, that's a weird way to describe Stanton. Also,
it wasn't just Stanton. So it was an insult to Stanton. In addition to that, it was also an insult to the Stanton newspaper. It was the insult was the Podunk newspaper is asking questions that I don't want to answer. So instead of answering their questions or returning their calls, returning their emails, like having an open dialogue with the media, he just insulted Stanton and also the Stanton newspaper. So that was his approach. Tim Kaine actually made several television commercials, all that, and threw millions of dollars at TV ads. So I think a lot of viewers knew about Hung Kao calling Stanton Podunk. And I believe there was another part of Virginia that he said it would be redonkulous to go there during the campaign. Did you catch that?
I did, but what was the part? I don't remember.
So I looked this up after we recorded, and he was talking about Abingdon, and he was saying why he didn't want to drive to Abingdon to debate the other Republican Senate primary candidates. Here's the clip.
For me to drive 6.5 hours down to Abingdon or something like that, and then to stand there with 4 other dudes to have 30 seconds to answer a question, it's just redonkulous. It's crazy.
Wow,
that's a ridiculous thing to say.
And can you all remind us how the Republicans selected Hung Kao as their Senate nominee? Did they do a primary this year?
There was a primary, right?
Well, sometimes they do a caucus.
I think there was a primary.
Yeah, I don't think they do caucuses anymore. They still one of the changes to state law during the time that the Democrats had both houses was they didn't completely get rid of the caucus system, but they made it very difficult to hold a caucus now. They changed some of the rules, and so caucuses are hypothetically possible, but would be very difficult to do legally these days.
That's true, Nathan. For any election that is on the normal calendar, it's actually not true for special elections. And we actually are about to see, I think later on this podcast, we'll be talking about 2 special elections where all of the candidates will be chosen not with a primary, but with party-run firehouse caucuses. There will be, I think, these 2 special elections we're about to talk about, one in Northern Virginia, one in the Richmond suburbs. I think the candidates will all be chosen by party-run events as opposed to the voters choosing the candidates.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Hung Kao won there was a primary, and Hung Kao won that actually pretty handily. He had 62% of the vote. All the other candidates in that primary were just, 10% or so.
It's great to be able to look things up on the internet mid-pod. So before we move on to those special elections and some of the down-ballot stuff, while we're talking about statewide, 1,600 people were purged from the voter rolls before Election Day. And that's not a huge number of people, but that case did go all the way to the Supreme Court. Do y'all want to talk about that ruling and what it means for elections?
Yeah, Michael can add to this too, I'm sure, but States, of course, they clean up their voter rolls from time to time, right? People pass away, people move. It's not uncommon, and Virginia was part of a really large group of states in a compact to sort of help do that. It was a nonpartisan organization that essentially assisted states when people moved to keep their voter rolls clean. Glenn Youngkin pulled out of that and then very recently decided that this was a time to make sure we don't have any non-citizen immigrants voting in our election this year. And so directed his administration to purge people that met certain criteria. Well, it swept up a lot of people that are citizens. And, out of those 1,600, I don't know the exact percentage that there were, but, there were quite a few stories published in the weeks leading up to Election Day about people who, had been purged, inappropriately. And so they had to either get it fixed before Election Day or cast a provisional ballot.
Actually, Nathan, I would take what you just said and flip it. So we've heard lots of examples about people who were citizens being denied the right to vote by being kicked off the voter rolls. You know what? You haven't heard any stories about someone who was an actual non-citizen. I think what we have yet to hear is one singular non-citizen who was purged from the rolls. All the stories that we've heard are actual citizens. And there's a reason for that, because if you look at the history of this law, it's a pretty recent history here. It dates back to 2006. When the bill was introduced by a state senator by the name of Ken Cuccinelli, who would later go on to be attorney general. He ran for governor. He was part of the Trump administration, but way back in 2006, he was a Republican senator representing Fairfax County, and he introduced a bill that was actually responding to the motor voter law from back in the Clinton era, which said that when you go to the DMV and you apply for your driver's license, you can, at the same time, this is a new thing at the time, you can also apply to register to vote. A lot of people were concerned that maybe these people who are getting driver's licenses, getting identification from the Department of Motor Vehicles, maybe they're not actually qualified to be voters. So we should take this list from the DMV and use it to do these monthly purges. After Senator Cuccinelli shopped this around the General Assembly, it got unanimous support in the House of Delegates. All of the Republicans and all of the Democrats in the House of Delegates circa 2006 voted in favor of this bill. Over on the Senate side, a lot of the Senate Democrats were against this, including Senator Luis Lucas, Senator Mamie Locke, and one of your hometown people there, Senator Cree Deeds of Charlottesville, voted against this bill back in 2006. I recently talked to Senator Deeds and asked him about his no vote on this Cuccinelli bill. And he said, why are we asking the DMV to come up with citizenship status? The DMV does a lot of things really well. Determining your citizenship status is not one of them. So the governor at the time was Tim Kaine, who had just been elected the previous year. This was his first ever General Assembly session. And he tried to make an amendment to kind of gut the bill a little bit. The Republicans who controlled the General Assembly rejected the governor's amendment. And then Governor Kaine signed the bill. Right. OK, so this is taking the DMV list and using that to purge existing voters. Let's talk for a minute about those existing voters. Every single person on the list of eligible voters have already demonstrated their citizenship. So we're taking a list of eligible voters who have already determined that they are eligible citizens, sometimes multiple times. And you're using this DMV list to strike people off the list of eligible voters who have already demonstrated that they are citizens. So all the data that we know about this purge program so far, we have yet to hear of one singular case where there has been any non-citizen voter. If you look at the entire time that Glenn Youngkin has been governor, there have been 0 prosecutions of any non-citizen voter. If you look at the last 20 years of data, you will find 0 non-citizen voters. So this whole thing about the DMV list that Governor Kaine signed is taking a flawed list and using it to strike eligible voters from the rolls.
So if they've been doing this monthly for almost 20 years, why did it come up now?
Because Governor Youngkin decided that he would take this monthly purge and do something a little different on the very last day of the quiet period where you're not supposed to strike voters. He said, instead of doing this as a monthly thing, we're going to do this as a daily purge. And so this was an executive order called by Governor Youngkin.
The quiet period, by the way, if you don't know about this out there listening, it refers to the 90 days before an election. So the idea that you're not going to take people off the list when the election's just around the corner. There won't be time to fix it if there's some issue.
And let me also add one of the things that emerged in the court discussion at the federal courthouse here in Alexandria. I was there for the entirety of the court discussions. One of the things that popped up is that there were some people who were stricken from the rolls, presented their citizenship, were restored to the rolls, and then kicked off again. This happened multiple times. And the reason for that is the daily purges. If you've got the list and you make a daily purge of people, sometimes people are going to get removed.
That's, here's the thing, too, to zoom it out. I mean, like, the facts of this are absolutely absurd. They just are. I mean, like, to do daily purges of people that are very clearly citizens with no evidence at all that there's any non-citizens on there, it's absurd. But
they will say there is evidence. Okay, so I'll walk through all the details. But from the perspective of the Attorney General, and they're going to make the argument. The appeals court will hear this, and when that happens, the Attorney General and the lawyers for the governor will say there is evidence these people are non-citizens. They did not check the box that said they were a citizen on this form.
Right. So somebody didn't check a small administrative detail box, which is a pretty human mistake to make. So the reason Youngkin's doing this, the reason Miyares is doing this, let's speculate on that.
He got to talk about thousands of non-citizen voters, which was not true.
Right.
And it impacted many Republican voters.
Well, that's just it, yeah. I mean, it's not like Democrats or Republicans are more or less apt to check that box, but you get to talk about that and then like make this boogeyman case that's simply not there, that there's a lot of non-citizens voting, that these non-citizens are going to come in and sway our election and steal America and blah, 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 blah. At the same time, and for this particular election that just happened between Trump and Harris, it was not going to sway that. But as far as the issue going forward, yeah, it matters a lot.
Well, you know what? It may have had more sway than you think. So the numbers are, I think a lawyer would call them de minimis, right? So 6,000 votes statewide, not going to change the outcome of anything. But what about the environment of fear you're creating in people who worry that they might be perceived as a non-citizen voter, even if they're a totally legitimate registered voter who is a citizen, that there might be a level of fear or apprehension based on the perception that people might think that this person is a non-citizen voter. I mean, I think that is difficult, if not impossible, to measure. But I think that you could make the case that was out there and part of this.
The chilling effect is present. That's a good point, Michael. I didn't think that one through.
So while we're talking about some of these more like structural voting things, I'm curious, have y'all looked at the early voting numbers? Is early voting up this year versus 2020 or down?
It was down compared to 2020. I don't have the percentages. Michael probably has that in front of him. But early voting is definitely down. I don't know what quite to make of that, though, because, I mean, we were deep in a pandemic at that point.
Well, you know what? I would encourage you to ask two different questions about early voting. There's early voting by mail, which is down significantly, but then there's also in-person absentee voting when you show up to the registrar's office and you actually walk in and you fill the ballot out there. That is actually on track. It's just exactly where we were at 2020. So during the pandemic, people used the postal service to do quite a lot of voting, and that's not gone, but is reduced rather significantly. But one trend here that we're seeing is that people are increasingly comfortable with the idea of voting early in person, and specifically that Republicans are way more interested, eager, willing to do in-person absentee voting, showing up early at the registrar's office. That's where we really have seen the change, because if you look at the sort of partisan lean of the people who are casting those ballots, it's now about 50-50. This is a new thing because it used to be just Democrats did early voting, mail-in, and in person. And now we're seeing a totally different trend, which is Democrats still have the edge in mail-in voting, which is down. But now there's kind of like a 50-50 split in terms of in-person early voting. It's about half Democrats and half Republicans.
In-person early voting, I mean, it's just convenient, And I did see this time, a lot of the Republican politicians and Trump himself this time started advocating for early voting. So I think that's probably eventually going to even out.
They did in October. What are they going to say in January when there are a dozen bills that are introduced in the General Assembly to roll back early voting? Those same people who were encouraging people to go out and vote early, those same people are going to be arguing in favor of rolling back early voting just as soon as the General Assembly session starts in January.
I did see, though, and this was true at least locally. It may not, I don't know. You've got the statewide numbers more than me. But in Albemarle County, the early voting came in. It was the last one to be counted, and it was more than half the total votes. And it changed the percentage pretty substantially in some local races and also, the tally for the national races. So I think at least here, it was still skewed to more Democrats voting early.
All right, should we talk about some of these House races?
Sure.
I want to start with just like a general overview. Like, could you kind of tell us how did the balance of Virginia's congressional representation look before and after the election?
The same is the short version. 6 Democrats and 5 Republicans in the 11 districts that we send to the U.S. House.
Did any districts change hands?
Nope.
No.
So, I mean, so this is the thing. Like, we just went through this huge and expensive campaign cycle, and the Democrats held all the seats they currently have. The Republicans held all the seats they currently have after spending millions and millions and millions of dollars on political ads. So,
that everyone famously loves to watch.
It was one of the most expensive status quos.
I actually like watching political ads, so maybe it's my fault. But so if you look at, there are 2 that we're going to look at here: the 7th congressional district in Northern Virginia and the 2nd congressional district in the Hampton Roads area. If you look at this Northern Virginia seat, one of the things about running for Congress in Northern Virginia is you're in the Washington, D.C. media market, which is extremely expensive. So guess how much money the candidates spent in the 7th congressional district on political ads? $16 million in the 7th congressional district. That's just on political ads, right? Then if you go down in Hampton Roads, the congressional seat down there, the 2nd congressional district, they spent $10 million in the Hampton Roads area, but which, by the way, is significantly cheaper than the Washington, D.C. media market, which means $10 million is going to buy you way, way more commercials than $16 million will buy you in the D.C. media market. That means that if you're in Hampton Roads, you have been completely flooded with political ads for the last month. And so it's interesting because your question was, okay, so did anything change as a result? The answer is no. We have total status quo after throwing 16 million plus 10 million, after throwing almost $30 million worth of political ads at this. We've got the exact same setup we did before the election.
It's a very expensive status quo.
Yeah.
It's a $30 million status quo.
Let's talk about some of these close races. What were some of the big issues? How did they do compared to the national election?
So the 2 close races everyone was watching was in the 7th congressional district. There was Democrat Eugene Vindman won with 51% of the vote versus Republican Derek Anderson, who had 49% of the vote. This was the congressional seat where they spent $16 million. So Vindman and Anderson put together spent $16 million in political ads. And it was an 8,000 vote margin of victory, which means that Derek Anderson was basically the most successful Republican that we will talk about. An 8,000 vote margin of victory for Vindman is a pretty small margin of victory for the Democrat. And so Anderson actually did way better than any of the other Republicans that we're going to talk about today. And so that was very close. I think a lot of people were surprised at how close that was. Even after spending $16 million.
It's kind of interesting how similar these guys' backgrounds really were. They both are military guys. They, frankly, ended up talking a lot about policy.
It's surprising how often campaigns actually get into policy sometimes.
Once in a while, in a year where it didn't feel like that was the main thing.
So then the other really important one that people were watching was this race in Hampton Roads, mostly a Virginia Beach seat. I think a majority of this district is actually in Virginia Beach, and there's a Republican incumbent there, Jen Kiggins, who was able to win with 51% of the vote versus Democrat Missy Cotter-Smassel, who had 47% of the vote. So that's a 16,000 vote margin victory for the Republican incumbent. And so, yeah, those were the close ones. Those were the ones that everyone was watching. But basically, the Dems held what they already held, and the Republicans held what they already held.
I mean, it's when I hear, like that the margins are shifting that much, but that none of the seats changed hands, I immediately jump to gerrymandering. Like, do you think that's a fair connection to make?
Not anymore.
No, I don't. Actually, I think that Virginia has been un-gerrymandered. Like there is no gerrymandering anymore, because the districts that we've got are a much closer approximation to actual communities of interest. I mean, I will actually point to the special elections that we're about to talk about in State Senate District 10 and State Senate District 32. I was actually looking at the details of how these Senate districts are configured, part of which is looking at the old version and comparing it to the new version. And, but with both of these Senate districts, if you look at the old version, they snake around and they go a little bit up here, they go a little bit down here. The newer versions are compact and they make sense. If you look at the map, it's like, oh, that's an actual area of people that live the same kind of life and have the same kind of interests, versus these wild districts that looked like a snake that was, attacking the map. And they're like, so yeah, I would say that not only is gerrymandering no longer a problem, but Virginia has been ungerrymandered.
Yeah, I would agree with that. This was one of those where we passed a bill to do, what was it called, Michael? The whole...
Oh, the commission. You're
commission,
talking about there was a constitutional amendment that created a redistricting commission, but they put like a fatal flaw in how they composed the members of the redistricting commission, which is that they were equally split among Democrats and Republicans. Guess what? They couldn't agree. And so the commission was totally pointless. And so there was like a backup plan. Plan B was, if the commission is deadlocked, send it to the courts.
Well, it was the special masters that got appointed. And
send it to the courts, and then the judges said, we're not doing this. We're going to appoint the egghead from California who's going to draw the maps.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a couple of guys that do the maps, and they essentially study the state really hard and drew maps that are actually pretty good. I mean, I think
Why do they need an egghead from California? They could have gotten someone there from UVA.
Yeah, come on, we've got eggheads.
I did, right. It really shows up on the House of Delegates and the state Senate maps where you do see these communities of interest. Before this, I remember there was a state Senate district that stretched from Albemarle County, almost Charlottesville, to just like basically Fredericksburg, just outside Fredericksburg. It was like, these places don't have a lot in common. We don't talk to each other. Like, why is this one district? And it's because of gerrymandering back then. Now the state Senate districts, the House districts make a lot more sense. You do still see some districts, though, like at the U.S. House level, like the 5th that Charlottesville's in, where Charlottesville and Albemarle...
That's because, it's impossible to draw a map that includes Charlottesville that doesn't include all that ruby red areas that are around Charlottesville.
Unless we were included in some Richmond area district or something. But yeah, you're right. I know, that's just the thing, is like the district's got to have almost 800,000 people, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, there's no way to do that with just Charlottesville and Albemarle's population and the regions around it that we, spend more time with.
Blame Thomas Jefferson.
We can do that for some things.
Nathan's rubbing off on me. I hope our podcast is almost over because I'm just talking to Nathan for a few minutes.
Let's talk about those special elections that you've been mentioning.
Let's talk about those special.
Yeah. Which ones are they? Whose seats? Yep.
Two of them. There's one in Northern Virginia, that's State Senate District 32. This is the seat currently held by Suhas Subramaniam in Loudoun County, and it's 100% Loudoun. So, this is one of those ungerrymandered seats where it's not like it's Loudoun and 12 other things. It's just Loudoun. And boy, howdy, are Loudoun County politics really forward in this election. Okay, so there are lots of people running in this election, but the two front runners I want to focus on. One is an incumbent member of the House of Delegates. He's got the establishment support in terms of all of the endorsements from, like, the Speaker of the House has endorsed this House member, and the Senate Majority Leader has endorsed this House member, and a very long list of names endorsing this incumbent member of the House to fill the state Senate seat. Another candidate in this race is one of the founding members of the Progressive Prosecutors for Justice, who was actually recently ousted from office. So she's a former Progressive Prosecutor for Justice. And a lot of Democrats in Northern Virginia are worried if she gets the nomination, she would be a polarizing candidate, and that Republicans would love to run against a progressive prosecutor for justice. Can't you imagine Governor Youngkin showing up for a campaign event and talking about the Soros-funded progressive prosecutor for justice that wants to let the criminal out of the insane asylum and have Hannibal Lecter show up in your kitchen to slit your throat with a knife. I mean, like, this is the Republicans would love to run against the former progressive prosecutor. So that is the special election.
Doesn't Trump
in
own
Northern Virginia?
Doesn't Trump own the trademark on Hannibal Lecter now? Can Youngkin use that?
Has anybody seen Silence of the Lambs? The late great Hannibal Lecter. The late great Hannibal Lecter would like to have you for dinner. They say, why does he keep mentioning it? Because Hannibal Lecter was a serious psycho. He was a slightly troubled patient. He mentions Hannibal Lecter. It doesn't make sense. So it makes a lot of sense.
No, you're right. I mean, I do get what you're saying, though, about Loudon being. I mean, it went Democratic again this time in the presidential race, but it's not a particularly progressive Democrat. It's suburban Democrat.
And can you remind everyone when these special elections are?
Any day now. We actually don't quite know because there's a series of events that has to take place. In some circumstances, the governor sets a date for the special election. But I think in this particular circumstance, the members of the General Assembly have done something strategic, which is that they have not adjourned. Even if they're not meeting every day, they are technically in session. And the reason that they did that was so that the Democrats who control the General Assembly are able to set the date for the special elections and not the Republican governor. So that's why they did this strategic thing of not adjourning, but staying in a kind of virtual, perpetual special session so the Democrats can set the date. That has not happened yet. So we don't know the date of the special election for the 32nd Senate District, but that'll be sometime soon, within the next few weeks. The resignations will set that ball in motion, and I don't think those have happened yet. Yeah. Keep in mind, we still have to certify this election that we just had.
The other special election is John McGuire, state senator who just got elected to the U.S. House from the 5th District, which, of course, as we mentioned, includes Charlottesville and Albemarle. So who's running in that seat? His state Senate seat. So,
the state Senate district that John McGuire currently represents is State Senate District 10. This is a kind of a newly created Senate district, like we were talking about redistricting a second ago. And so he's leaving. So if you look at the map here, this is like Hanover, Powhatan, Louisa, Goochland, the kind of suburbs and exurbs between Richmond and Charlottesville and Lynchburg, that sort of triangle between Richmond, Charlottesville, Lynchburg. So I've been hearing about a certain former state senator who I believe has already launched her campaign for this particular state Senate district. This is a state senator who used to be representing Chesterfield, and I believe she has moved out of Chesterfield and into the state Senate District 10 specifically to run for the seat that McGuire is vacating.
You'll have to tell me. I actually had not heard this yet.
Senator Amanda Chase wants to make a comeback and get elected to the seat currently represented by John McGuire.
Oh yeah, Trump and heels. She's everybody's most colorful. I was going to say everybody's favorite. She's everybody's most colorful politician.
So that particular district, I think, has some other candidates. There is a party leader from Powhatan, like a Republican party leader from Powhatan. I think also the Louisa County Board of Supervisors chairman is thinking about being a candidate. So, I mean, in order to win this, you would need to Hanover is the largest chunk of voters. So you would need to sort of do some campaigning in Hanover, but also Powhatan, Louisa, Goochland. So this is actually split up over a bunch of different jurisdictions, and also will not be decided by voters. Keep in mind, this is a Republican event that's going to choose the nominee here. This is a firehouse caucus or whatever you want to call it, not the voters choosing.
Oh, yeah.
This.
So a caucus convention then might actually make it tougher for Amanda Chase.
Well, she's famous for burning bridges, but she burned bridges in Chesterfield. These are new bridges for her.
So many new bridges to burn. I don't know. I guess we're going to hear more about it coming up, but this will be a fun one to watch, potentially.
All right. Should we go broad? Talk about takeaways?
Sure.
Take it away.
Yeah. So, again, you can take this either like nationally or state. Were you all surprised by the election results on Tuesday night?
No. No, I wasn't surprised. I think maybe a little bit, some parts of it. I was surprised that Kamala Harris lost the national popular vote. Honestly, I did think I did not place a lot of faith in the better polls. And actually, Michael, we didn't get to talk about this, but I kind of wonder if polling is just broken in America right now. And I don't know if that's Trump specific in the Trump era, or if it's just that polling itself is just a broken industry at this point. But yeah, it's definitely not working out real well. I think otherwise, the surprise, I think, to me is that she lost all 7 swing states and that Virginia was as close as it was. I did expect her to win Virginia, of course, but I kind of thought it'd be around 6, 7, 8% rather than 5.5%. And I think that reflects the overall turnout and vote patterns across the country.
Is polling broken? Gosh, I don't know. I mean, keep in mind, every time you're looking at a poll in the run up to the election, they all had a margin of error. Mm-hmm. And, a lot of the polls were accurate. If you keep in mind, it could have been 3 points in this direction or 3 points in that direction. One thing that I think, I mean, if you're asking about surprise, I would say one of the takeaways from this election would be that 2016 was not an aberration where like this guy who was not popular accidentally got elected because the Electoral College is weird and he didn't have the majority support, but he got elected. That was not an aberration. This is a movement. This is a realignment. I mean, like this kind of the Trumpism kind of reminds me of the era of Andrew Jackson. I mean, actually, if you look at Indian killing Andrew Jackson, I think you will find a lot of very similar politics with Trump and Trumpism and MAGA. And so now, we're in an environment where, the Republicans are really excited about looking forward to a second Trump administration. I will note one of the takeaways I saw in among the right-wing Republican media was in an outlet called Town Hall, which your listeners probably don't spend a lot of time reading Town Hall, but I'd like to monitor what they're saying on these right-wing sites. And so there's an article with the headline, "We want it and we need to act like it." And here's the lead to this article. "Breathe deeply and savor the musky scent of broken leftist dreams. Smells like freedom. Now we must get busy hummeling our enemies. Some silly people will say that you shouldn't kick an opponent when he's down. That's actually the best time to kick him." That's according to Town Hall, right? I mean, These are the people that are about to take over Washington.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, it is, and the guardrails are all gone. They're all gone. I think Jamel Bowie and others have really explained every system failure that was required for this to happen this way. Every system failure that was required for Trump to be able to even run this time and not be imprisoned somewhere. Every system failure that is about to happen because we no longer have anybody who's going to be part of this administration who has any institutional memory of what Washington, quote unquote, is supposed to be like. And so we're going to have policy by Steve Bannon and policy by Stephen Miller, and it's going to be inflicting a lot of harm on a lot of people. And that's the point. That's the point. That's what they want. I mean, and the
cruelty is the point.
Yeah, and they're living in this information ecosystem of deep unreality that's out there. And I've been reading too about how in 2016 this particular political reporter wrote about how at Trump's rallies a lot of folks are like, oh, he's this guy's like too much, but we support him. We think he's going to do right, and we need change. But it's really the odious stuff was a liability. Now it's what they want. They eat it up. And so Kamala and other people describing Trump as a fascist. It's like, that's the point. That's a feature, not a bug.
Well, where I live in Northern Virginia, there is a less violent but very pronounced concern about federal employees. Like the way the federal government is organized, there are political people and then there are career people. And what happens when the political people get in and figure out a way to fire all the career people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or move their jobs to Nebraska.
Right.
So, I mean, it's kind of terrible to ask this question like a couple days after we just had an election, but does this influence how y'all were thinking about the 2025 governor's race at all?
I think that's still...
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah? What's your take?
All right. Well, let's start on the Republican side. Republican Attorney General Jason Miyares was thinking about running for governor. I would say it seems unlikely that he would run for governor, or at least that the dynamics are such that I'm sure the case for not running for governor would be a very strong case because a couple things. One is there's this traditional thing where when the Republicans win the White House, Democrats have a good chance of winning the governor's office, right? So there's only been two recent examples where this sort of political rule has been violated. So it's very likely Democrats will have a very good year for the statewide races in 2025. So that would be Jason Miyares potentially running for re-election. There's also lots of speculation about Republican Governor Glenn Youngkin taking an administration gig and vacating the office of the executive mansion, which would mean that the Republican Lieutenant Governor Winsome Earl Sears would become the governor. And so she would, under that scenario, which is hypothetical, she would run as an incumbent.
Quickly hopping in with a little update, and that is on Thursday, Governor Glenn Youngkin said to reporters that he was committed to finishing out his 4-year term as governor of Virginia. So it looks unlikely that he would leave early to join the Trump administration.
So all of that is on the Republican side. On the Democratic side, Abigail Spanberger has cleared the field. I mean, there was some competition kind of early on, and she has cleared the field, and she's the lone person at the top of the Democratic ticket. And I think, history shows that she's got a pretty good chance of being elected governor next year. The real question is, obviously, the race for lieutenant governor. Lots of people want to be lieutenant governor, including the incumbent lame duck mayor of Richmond, LeVar Stoney, who initially had a campaign to be governor. He pulled out of that race so that he could run for lieutenant governor. And there are a bunch of other people. I think Ghazala Hashmi is thinking about running for lieutenant governor. Aaron Rouse is thinking about running for lieutenant governor. And so, yeah, that's actually going to be really crowded, the lieutenant governor race. And then there's the attorney general race. I think you've got Commonwealth's attorney there in Henrico, who wants to be the attorney general. I believe there is a former member of the House of Delegates who also wants to be the attorney general. So on the Democratic side. So yeah, the politics of 2025 are just now starting because all these people have been kind of delaying making a final decision based on the results of the election. Well, they're looking at those results right now and making their determination this week and next week. And so I think we're going to be hearing some announcements on 2025 pretty soon.
Well, thank you both so much for coming on.
Thanks, MG. Glad to be back on the show.
Yeah.
Is this where we hear the outro music, the glockenspiel? Do, 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 do. This has been tons of fun. Thanks for asking me.
And we'll be back with, typical egghead content in a couple weeks. This is our one, electioneering election episode of the year. Well, thanks so much for tuning in to this post-election episode of Bold Dominion. Our guests were Michael Pope, journalist covering Virginia and the host of Pod Virginia, and Nathan Moore, former host of Bold Dominion. Thank you both so much for spending so much time breaking down this election with us. I also want to thank our assistant producer, Sarah Bastianelli. You can find more episodes of Bold Dominion at bolddominion.org or wherever else fine podcasts are served. And please don't forget to subscribe. We'll be back in a couple weeks.